I need some traction. You need some traction.
My name is Lloyd Lobo. I'm the co-founder of Boast AI and TractionConf. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm super passionate about this topic, which is how to scale fast in Canada and all about the Canadian ecosystem. Today I have with me Cherry from Accel Partners, Hugh from Inovia Capital, Chris, founder of C100 and BreakawayGrowth, and Daniel Sachs, founder, CEO of AppDirect. Daniel, let's kick things off with you. Introduce yourself. What is your connection with Canada, the ecosystem? Give us your story.
Thanks, Lloyd, and thanks for hosting this. This is great. So I grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, so near Niagara Falls, and went to McGill University in Montreal. And at the time, it was pre-2009, so like 2007, I was in Montreal, and there was very little talk about tech. But ended up coincidentally visiting my friend who was a Montrealer that had moved to San Francisco to be at Bain Company. That's Nicolas Desmarais, and who's my co-founder today. And we brainstorm ideas for businesses, and really ultimately discovered kind of the emergence of cloud and how that could help businesses around the world. My origin story for that was that my family had a furniture store in Niagara Falls, Canada, on Main Street called Saks Furniture for 100 years. And in the height of the Great Recession, we had to close it down. And I really attributed that to lack of access to technology and capital. So at the same time, Nick was in San Francisco and learning about cloud and how that could transform big businesses. So we really said, how do we create a platform to distribute cloud services around the world? And we got all Canadian investors to kick it off. So our angel investor was Eric Boyko, who's the CEO of Stingray Digital, which is public on the TSX. And then Inovia was our first seed investor and ultimately led our A as well. So when two Canadians in San Francisco, quite coincidentally, 2009. And at the time, I think Silicon Valley had a lot of unique deep tech experience. And for what we wanted to do, we wanted to kind of get the intersection of commerce and cloud, which really Salesforce had pioneered, and the talent in the Bay Area was very unique for that. So started in the Bay Area, scaled to our first 100 in our San Francisco headquarters, and then actually acquired a company that was coincidentally in Ottawa. And then from there, we just discovered and kind of, had this like untapped talent across Canada. We opened up a Montreal office. We've done 4 acquisitions in Canada. We have teams in Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and now we're a global organization of about 700, approaching 250 in Canada with over 150 open recs in Canada. So for those of you who are Canadian and looking, we're thrilled to join. But still to this date, we're an all Canadian board. And even though it's funny, like we have big investors in the US, like Mithril, which is Peter Thiel's growth VC, but our board member Ajay is Canadian. So it's been great to see the growth there. And ultimately really proud, and we can speak to this later, of the teams that we built across the country and the world.
Awesome. Cherry, give us your background and your connection to Canada.
Sure. So I'm definitely the least Canadian person on this call. So I was born in China and then moved to the States with my family when I was 3. Grew up outside of the Boston area, went to Harvard. I started my career off in private equity, and basically after 5 years of doing that, decided it was a lot of capital engineering and not a lot of actual building. And so in 2013 in New York, which itself was kind of a tech-starved ecosystem, decided to go do something different, and was fortunate enough to be employee number 60 at a company that many of you on the call are pretty familiar with, which is Lightspeed HQ. Which, as most folks on the call know, is now a publicly traded company. So I was there for about 5 years and was an executive there. While I was there, helped them raise about $250 million in venture, including from Inovia, our good friends on the call here, and acquired and helped integrate about 3 companies, led our payment strategy and turned us into what's called a payment facilitator, which is also a business model that Shopify uses. And then most recently taught myself how to program and led a 30-person data team that helped the rest of the org make better, faster decisions. I was really, really proud of what my team looked like and where folks were from. We had someone from Madagascar and folks from basically everywhere else in between. And it was a really wonderful experience to build such a diverse team up in Montreal. Nowadays, I've been switched back over to the investing side, so I'm now a partner at Accel. Accel is a multi-stage, multi-sector global venture capital firm. We have offices, I'm based in San Francisco. We have offices in Palo Alto, London, and Bangalore, India, and active investments everywhere from Jakarta, Indonesia, to Salt Lake City, Utah, and everywhere in between. Most recently in Canada, we've invested in a company called Ada Support. We were also the $200 million check into 1Password in Toronto last year. Obviously investors in Lightspeed as well. So we've been big supporters of the Canadian ecosystem over the years. And I like to say we got there before it was cool. At Accel, I focus on checks of 20 million and up into a variety of company types, but with a special focus on financial technology as well as software as a service.
Awesome. That's fantastic background and the only non-Canadian here, but great connections to Canada. Chris, let's take it with you. I would say you're almost the godfather of the Canadian ecosystem in the Valley.
Man, that's the first time that term's been used for me, but I'll take it. So I'm a Kingston kid originally, had 5 startups, 2 in Canada, 1 in Russia, 2 in the Valley. I was very fortunate to work with Terry Matthews in Ottawa, built Nubers Networks up to $1.6 billion and took it public on the TSE, NASDAQ, and then New York. That's probably the first time I figured out what big was and really got hooked on that idea, truly building global dominant companies, which I think is the thing we're talking about today. It was really privileged after that to move on the venture side and invest on the founders at DocuSign, at Pinterest, Juniper Networks are sort of 3 of the bigger ones. Co-founded a thing called the C100 in the middle of the recession when Nortel was going bankrupt, BlackBerry was going sideways, just with a friend of mine, Anthony Lee, just not believing Canada was done on innovation and we could build great, awesome global companies like Dan's again, and was really privileged again to work with Toby and Harley when they had a small office in downtown Ottawa. Now just a quick segue, C100 had its 10th anniversary just a couple of months ago. Over 30% of global tech IPOs value globally was founded by Canadians. Companies like Lightspeed and Cherry's and Dax and the crew there, PagerDuty, Cloudflare, Shopify, and others, over 168 billion built out of the last Great Recession. So super excited to see the great companies that are on here today that will look back in a decade and say, you guys fucking killed it, and figure out ways we might be able to help you.
Awesome. And last but not the least, and Hugh helped put this webinar together, so thank you so much. Hugh, why don't you give us your background, your connection to Canada? Of course, you're Canadian. And why is Canada having a moment right now? Let's close your intro with that question and let everyone else take it as well. Yeah, go ahead, Hugh.
For sure. So that's a crazy stat, Chris. Actually, I had not heard that 30% of global equity creation via Canadian founders. Anyway, so hey everyone. My name is Hugues. I'm a principal on Inovia's growth equity team. I spent most of my time with enterprise software companies from the Series B stage onward. So for those of you who don't know Inovia, we manage just over $1 billion in committed capital across 5 VC funds. We are a distributed team anchored in Canada with offices in Montreal, where I'm based, and also in Toronto, Calgary, San Francisco, and London, UK. And so the gist of our strategy is really designed to empower Canadian diaspora founders scale from seed to IPO and beyond. And you know, the work we've done with Lightspeed and AppDirect and many others in our portfolio, I think captures that perfectly. They've also been, you know, the companies through which I've got to know Dan and Cherry over the years, so I'm super thankful for that. I also want to give a shout out to Chris and the C100, because we are talking about, you know, the change agent in the Canadian ecosystem, and I think the C100 was definitely one of you know, those forces that increase the connectivity of the network. And Lloyd, I think your role also with Boast and Traction, expanding the network was also super important. So I think to your last question, Lloyd, just to give you a little bit of color, you know, for the purpose of this conversation, we recently ran a little research and found that there are more Canadian companies on the path to IPO today than there was in the last 10 years combined. And so that kind of speaks to, I think, the inflection point that we've reached in the ecosystem. And, you know, in my mind, it's clear that Canada is now a growth market opportunity as opposed to primarily a venture market opportunity. At a personal level, when I started in tech, you know, 7 years ago, I remember reading that article about Hootsuite raising their 165 million Series B or something like that. And that really sent a shockwave in the ecosystem, and that it reminded people like, crap, I can build a large company, you know, up north. I think what we're seeing now is like this much larger cohort of globally minded growth stage company. And it really feels like those large 100 million plus rounds are kind of happening once every other month, rather than being the exception to the norm.
As a non-Canadian, but connections working with a Canadian company and then now investing in a lot of Canadian deals, what have you observed over the last several years that have shifted in the ecosystem, and why now? Why is it more interesting in the last few years to invest more in Canada? If I looked at it as a founder 10 years ago, nobody cared as much as they do now. So like, from your perspective outside looking in, why now?
Yeah, I would take a little bit of umbrage, especially as someone who works at a fund that's been investing outside of Silicon Valley, that like no one was taking an interest a decade ago. I think, you know, we've always had the belief that tech companies can grow anywhere. But I think Canada, you know, to the point of some of the other panelists here, is really having a moment. And I think, you know, the best way I can illustrate that with it is just like with a personal anecdote. My former colleague, now friend, Julian, who was the SVP of sales at Lightspeed, is an incredibly special guy. You know, he's very dear to me. We worked together for a really long time, but he's also one of the best salespeople, I think, on the planet. And, you know, maybe a decade ago, Julian, having completed his stint at Lightspeed, would have had to go, you know, here to Silicon Valley or elsewhere to go find his next job. But instead he landed and just started actually last week as Chief Revenue Officer of 1Password, which is based in Toronto. And I am happy to say he's staying in the Accel family, which is wonderful for us. And I think like that really illustrates like, you know, part of what is becoming very special in Canada is you're seeing not just, you know, one success story in Shopify or two in Shopify and Lightspeed, but really a generation of companies that are growing together and growing very quickly, and creating folks who have had the experience of going through hypergrowth, who can stay in Canada and who, you know, have both learned and then matured in this ecosystem. And I think that is really like a tipping point moment for me, as I think about, you know, where can you build companies? Like, as anyone who's actually been in a company seat can attest to, all there is at the end of the day is who you have on the bus and the culture that you have. And Canadian companies have always been kind of like world-class in terms of culture. I definitely, think of Shopify as being incredibly thought leading there with everything they've done for mental health and just the incredible work that Toby and his team have been doing. But in terms of people, it was always a concern. And I can say, like, at Lightspeed, we always were strapped for engineers and talent. And, I was imported, our CFO was imported from the US. But now that we've had this generation of folks who have really gone through this first cycle, I think, of companies kind of being born and then going public in Canada, it's really, you really have a true tipping point in the ecosystem. And I think one thing that's made Silicon Valley very special is this recycling of talent. And we're starting to see that in Canada as well.
Chris, you're just moving back to Canada. Why is Canada having a moment? What are the things you've observed? I mean, you've seen so many companies from like idea stage to IPO, having been the founder of C100 and all the companies you've invested in. Why now?
Yeah, well, I think in fairness to Canada and Canada tech scene, this is actually our second wave. So if you look at the wave that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, it was really around the telecom boom. Companies like Ciena, Newbridge Networks, Corel, that were almost 40% of the TSE total value. Back in the mid time you got to the mid 90s. So it was there before. There were some really big structural challenges though for Canada. One was Section 16 in the Tax Act that basically made it very difficult for U.S. firms to invest in Canada. It was very expensive. That's one of the first things that the C100 focused on was if you could get rid of the barriers for three things: the movement of capital, the movement of people, and the movement of ideas and access to markets, Canada could compete with anybody, hands down. We knew that to be true from the late 90s. So we removed the barrier to capital by the time we hit 2010. Canada's actually advantaged on access to people globally, in part because of the US immigration, H-1B issues. If you look at Canada right now, it's 5 times the skilled labor force on a per capita basis in the US. If you're the smartest woman from France coming out of MIT, and you're the smartest kid from Bangladesh at Stanford, and you want to start up a startup together, you go to Toronto. No other city in North America allows you to go there, build your team, have access to capital, have access to markets, and hire the best in the world and have them land there in weeks. And the numbers show that. If you look at the total tech growth, from tech workers' point of view, the total number of tech new jobs in 2019 was about 25,000 across all US cities. Toronto alone added 27,000 in that year, one city. So that's really what we saw in 93 when Boston lost its way to the Valley, is when capital, the way of building companies, the labor force got stagnant, Boston lost its advantage. And I really think there's a chance, and I wrote about it last year, that Canada could displace the Valley. And I think Toby talks about this a lot. He says 2030 came early. So we're basically, all the tech trends are accelerating by a decade because of COVID. And Canada accelerating is one of those. And so I'm, have a look at the post. I threw it in the chat. Would love people's feedback. Boris Wirtz, another friend who's early at the C100 helping us, did another post that Georgia Tech just put out that basically showed Canada also dominating, new tech jobs and tech immigration. I think all the signs point to we're going to have another 10 plus Shopify's, and why would you be anywhere else than in the middle of that? So I'm sitting in an F-150 on the border between Michigan and Ontario and driving across the border tomorrow, and excited to do so.
I want to take the next question here around on the ground dynamics. You're say a Bay Area company or a US company. What's really interesting is over the last 6 months, I must have helped 12 companies or so. And in the last year, about 20 Bay Area companies set up in Canada. In fact, Every time there's a founder looking for advice around that, Dan just introduces them to me. I think Chris Terlica was the last one at Maintenex. But I'm seeing a lot of this. Let's set up engineering teams in Canada, and then we get questions around like, what are the major hubs? Do I do Montreal? Do I do Toronto? Or is Vancouver very similar culturally? So let's take that with you, Dan, because you've set up across Canada. What are the on-the-ground dynamics here? What's your experience working with different tech hubs?
Thanks, Lloyd. The dynamics have shifted dramatically. So just 10 years ago, there was very little infrastructure for a tech founder to find a community. In Toronto, there was Mars in the early days, and then only, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, Notman House in Montreal, and that's where company VCs like Inovia and Real Ventures and others started to network. But today, there's just much more of a acknowledgement on campuses, in the community, in the press, around the value of technology and tech hubs across Canada. I think that when we look at Canada as a country, there are a lot of cultural tenets that make hiring Canadians as a whole incredible. And Chris touched on the immigration and tax advantages. There's great incentive as well. But beyond that, culturally, what we've found is that a lot of the Canadian values align with the values of really building long-term growth. And I remember 10 years ago, a lot of the critique on Canadian founders is that they were less risk averse and therefore working on not as bold ideas. But I think that shifted a lot, where you get loyal team members on the ground that are willing to solve deep problems, and they commit to those teams and cultures. And the examples of Lightspeed and Shopify and Hootsuite that have been shared on the call are companies that I think uniquely differentiate based on their focus on core values and a long-term vision. And you can just feel it in their products and in the way you interact, that there's a special culture behind these companies that's unique from people in other areas. And then I would say tangibly, for people who haven't experienced activating the Canadian environment, that every hub does have a little bit of a different approach. I know Chris has talked a lot about Toronto, and if you look at aggregate job ads, I think Toronto is probably accelerating a bit. We've seen our growth and space in Montreal. We can hire an incredibly diverse workforce coming from many different schools, speaking many languages. Our Montreal office services so many countries around the globe, and it's phenomenal to see the diversity of talent there. But we also have teams in Ottawa, in Calgary, all unique in their approach. I think Ottawa, you have the advantage now of tech ecosystems that Terry spoke to, whether it's Shopify or Newbridge or others. People speak a lot about Waterloo and the value of the university there and the BlackBerry diaspora. But even Calgary, which primarily you'd see as like an oil boom town, you have great deep engineering tech that now with let's say the oil industry not being as strong, who are passionate about learning about technology. So what we've found is across our Canadian hubs, we've had kind of specialty areas that really reflect the culture of the city. So in Ottawa, we're focused on billing and commerce. In Montreal, it's really our global e-commerce and thinking about our platforming and kind of building our storefront builders and capabilities that you have similar experience with Lightspeed and Shopify. Then in Calgary, they're really focused on our deep device tech and sectors like automotive that we're working with. So it's really interesting to see across the country really a lot of differences. Being connected through the C100 or Lloyd or others, I'm so excited to see entrepreneurs coming from everywhere. I spoke to someone recently from the East that had sold a company to Salesforce earlier, and their essentially team is now growing. And then even my hometown of St. Catharines, we have a venture funded company that's based in St. Catharines. The founder's named Ransom, really cool company, but just great to see all these cities producing incredible tech companies.
So on that point, Dan, maybe just to expand on what you just said, I think it's such an important point to make, that you know, Canada is made up of a bunch of ecosystem. Like Bay Area, people think of, you know, Toronto KW as kind of the shiny object. You know, there is scale and critical mass in Toronto KW with about, you know, a 250,000 tech talent pool. But, you know, I think as you point out, then like Calgary and Western Canada as a whole is also booming. Like, you know, just looking at the amount of capital that went out west in the last 12 months, I think there's a handful of companies that have raised $1 billion, like a Clio, a Trulio, a Simon, who invested into. Despite the fact that the ecosystem may be slightly more distributed, and same thing in Montreal. So I think it's just an important point to make. And, you know, corollary to that, I think what we've seen across the portfolio is a shift in the CEO's mindset. Like, to Chris, your point about the second wave, you know, of Canada's momentum, I think, you know, when I started, I don't think you had the same level of peer connection, meaning that you didn't necessarily have CEOs in every major city and across Canada actually building global companies. And I think that shift in mindset has been a huge enabler in you know, supporting the growth stage companies that we're now seeing.
How about you, Chris? Let's talk about some of the ecosystems outside of Toronto. What are you seeing here? Because we hear a lot about Toronto from a talent, Toronto, Waterloo from a talent perspective, but, you know, culturally and a proximity factor, BC, Alberta is very close, but you know, what are some of the ecosystems doing outside of Toronto? You have a bigger view on that than me with C100 and all.
Well, you know, I think, you know, the interesting thing is to see the shift across the tech hubs across North America. Like I said, in Boston used to be the dominant tech place, you know, up until '93 when the Valley took over. You're seeing, you know, the really, you know, the best engineers really be able to dominate the conversation in the sense of they want to live where they want to live. And that moved, you know, the sort of strip mall mentality of the Valley to the San Francisco. It moved the whole conversation around Boston, the East Coast, to being in the urban core in New York. And I think for the same reasons, a decade ago, Toby and Harley smartly said, look, we're going to build our company in downtown Ottawa and screw Canada. And I think that, you know, the smart founders realized to get the best talent, you need to give people a quality of life and a place to live where they can really have a great experience for themselves professionally, but also personally. So if you think about it through that lens, Montreal's a great city, Vancouver's a great city. I think the big barrier, and there was one question in the chat about, you know, how do you think about trying to hire somebody in San Francisco versus hiring them to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver? The biggest challenge really was, if this gig doesn't work, where am I going to go? And so Cherry alluded to this, and Hugues did as well. And I think that's changed now that who made the point. There's the density of opportunity of really great companies. And I remember a couple of founders in Toronto, in particular, the founder of League, basically took a Perspective Canada around to 12 other companies in and around Waterloo and Toronto and said, look, if you don't want to work at League, there's all these other great companies you can go to, and it'll be awesome. And I do think that, you know, that's happening, and you see it in the numbers. Again, you know, the numbers that we just saw from Boris Wirtz from Georgia Tech said, you know, the net migration of not just tech workers, but very talented executives, you know, it has shifted to Canada decidedly over the U.S. And that's Canada, you know, at 1/10 the size versus the U.S. Canada's, you know, 5 times as big as the U.S. today. Yeah. So it's happening. I think the challenge with Vancouver is they hadn't had a real breakout success yet. And that's maybe why, you know, Toronto, again, with the density of opportunity, may have a bit of an advantage, but I do expect that to change. I think Montreal and Vancouver over the next 24 months are going to show really well.
Yeah, Maybe just to double click on Chris's point, I think for everyone on the call, like the perspective on the ground really in Canada is that you have this Toronto, tech employee base of like 250K, and then you expand to Montreal, it's probably half of Toronto KW and then half in Western Canada. And I think the change of mindset that we've seen is, not only relative to the opportunity set available to people in Canada, but Lloyd, to your point about the explosion of Bay Area companies opening offices in Canada, I think more and more CEOs realize that you actually need to pay up and compete not just locally. So I'm making a case for like the storm the castle argument here, that increased competition is a net positive because it just elevates the thinking around building a venture scale company in Canada.
So far we're only talking about sort of the Canadian successes and the breakouts, right? So I'm a big fan of Western Canada as well, although I'm a Toronto boy. There are a lot of good companies, if you look at from a local perspective, things like Hootsuite did a lot, Vision Critical, Unbounce, and so on. But if you look at some of the Bay Area companies that have set up there, Segment, you got MailChimp, you got Zenefits, you've got Zapier, you've got Slack. It's huge, right? So we do Traction every year in Vancouver, and I kid you not, if you go to tractionconf.io and you see the list of speakers, they're all Bay Area unicorns, and everyone's flying up, and they're investigating Vancouver from a ecosystem talent perspective. When you're initially setting up in Canada and looking for your first key execs, do you find it hard to convince people from the Bay Area to move? I think with COVID and everything now, perhaps it may or may not matter, but like, how are you bringing those initial anchors for your team, or are you finding them locally? And then when you anchor them, find those anchors, do you say, do they have more affinity towards Vancouver or any other particular, or Toronto or any other particular ecosystem?
Yeah, a couple points here. I think things have changed in the current work environment, and ultimately, Canada I see as a global, like essentially a national footprint to scale now versus just local. And if you're an enterprise in the Valley looking to start in Canada, I think it's really about like what's the best talent pool for you and who's a great leader that can make that work. And when we first had, our San Francisco and then Ottawa and Montreal footprints, we had an issue where, it felt like headquarters was managing another, entity that was like not as part of the flow of decision-making, et cetera. And then we actually had the same issue when we opened up our Pune, India office, that people in India thought that they were being managed by people in Montreal. So I think that your culture needs to shift with the remote environment. And I think geography still matters, but being very clear and methodical about what the purpose of that office is. And I think that in many ways, Canada now has the ability in all these markets to drive strategy. And I think you need to have a clear thesis for what talent pool you're trying to tap. So if, and a lot of that actually hinges upon the companies in those markets. So if you're an e-commerce, business, probably looking at Shopify and some early team members there that might want to go and start, lead your office, it could be a really interesting market. If you're interested in, AI, obviously, Montreal and Toronto have great academic environments that you can, start. Or if you're looking at, telecom, maybe it's Waterloo. So I think you need to have a thesis on what talent pool you're going after. And then really it comes down to that individual that can lead the group. But the one thing I'd urge all founders to think about is that creating a second office just to have a low-cost center or a secondary place next to the Valley, I think isn't the right way to approach it anymore. In the remote environment, you really want to look at like where can you level up in terms of talent, loyalty, and I think that's the mistake that I see being made the most. is that, and then frankly, we did that as well. We said, okay, Montreal would be a good second market for us versus saying, where can we get the talent that's actually the best in the world and use Canada as a magnet to also bring in experts from whether it's the United States or Europe or globally, and use Canada as that magnet. And I know Chris alluded to that as well with some of the advantages now in terms of immigration and visas that's really allowing people globally to come to Canada and operate with great talent.
Awesome. Let's dive a little bit into that. Canada is a magnet for tech talent at all levels, right? So let's start with companies like yourself that are at scale. What are the top things that you see that serve as that magnet? Your top, like maybe 5 benefits, and each of you, I'd love to hear that from each of you, starting with Dan, Chris, Cherry, and then Hugh.
Yeah. So number one, I think it comes down to access to talent, and like I alluded to earlier. The alignment in culture and values to build a modern, digitally transformed company. I find, the Canadian values and talent pools are great. The academic hubs as well, like McGill is just doing such a great job, as well as other schools across Canada at investing in deep tech and producing great engineering, but also interdisciplinary activity around startups. So I think, the talent is definitely one big anchor. I think there's also, the competitive landscape around what other tech environments are there and available. So I think there's just more great companies to network and benchmark. So if you look at, peer CEOs, there's just incredible companies to learn from in Canada. The third, I would say, would definitely be the access to the VC community. So it's incredible to see companies or VC firms like Inovia or Accel, investing in Canada, cultivating Canadian networks, and really providing great availability. One thing that used to be a big draw to Canada, which still is, and I don't think we should undervalue, is some of the tax incentive. So for those of you who aren't familiar, you should speak to Lloyd about shred credits and just different tax advantages, but huge advantages there. And then I think ultimately, we've alluded to this a little bit, but what's a place that people want to be, and where can people live from an immigration perspective? And more, I'm finding people say, I love the Canadian values. I love living there, and I could maybe get a nicer house than San Francisco. I could, have more space. I can learn new things. So I think that, just the Canadian environment for immigration and for living, I think is another driver.
Fantastic. Cherry and Hugh, I want you guys to take a little different spin on this, right? So Dan, of course, is running a scale stage company. We're seeing a lot of smaller Bay Area companies, like sort of like seed to Series A in the 5 to 50 person range, looking at Canada and building their teams there. So Cherry, for you, when competing for talent, you're competing with larger companies. How do you see Canada as a magnet for talent for some of these other smaller companies, whether it's with Bay Area or international companies relocating to Canada?
Sure. So I think, the reality is, like, it's competitive for everybody. It's not a Canadian problem. Like, I can tell you our early stage companies that are based here in the Bay lament the fact that they have to compete against, the monster Google salary and equity package as well. So it's not just a Canadian thing, it's a global thing. So I think it comes down to, like, what do people care about and optimize for in their careers? And one thing that I think is really shifting the mindset around Canada is the fact that you have had, as Chris alluded to, that first wave of kind of more telecom, and now like the wave that I'm more familiar with, which is more on the software side of folks. And you're seeing that, like, you can have a large exit based out of Canada. And I think that goes a long way towards folks valuing the early stage equity that's coming out of these Canadian companies. When I can tell you, like, as on the ground from Lightspeed, when we would give people equity packages, they really didn't know how to think about it. It's when you're kind of competing against folks who were in Montreal. A lot of our engineers were from the large gaming studios, just given the kind of historical folks who have been in Montreal. early stage people really didn't think of equity as being part of their compensation. And it was difficult for them to think that that was going to be real money, right? There just haven't been that many examples, back in, call it 2015, 2016, of Canadian companies really making it on the global stage and having that equity convert to things that are economically valuable for people. So I think, again, like as you see this maturation and this kind of second wave of companies coming up and really proving to the global stage that Canada can be a great home, you guys are just going to be increasingly more competitive. I can also say, like drawing on my experience of someone who was very new to the Canadian ecosystem and really did not understand a lot of the mechanisms that were in place. When I first heard about Shred, I thought our finance team was joking. I was like, wait, the Canadian government gives you money? Like, I don't understand this. And I think, having lived in Montreal for 5 years, at least part of the time, things like Shred make a big difference. And I think frankly, not a lot of American companies know about it still.
US has a very similar program. R&D tax credits has been around since the 80s. And the US government gives you 10% of your R&D spend, and it's not a cashback, right? In Canada, with Shred, is 64 to 70%. It ends up being cashback. In the US, it's a tax credit. You can either offset income taxes or payroll taxes. Now with COVID, and most funded startups are not profitable, and with COVID, payroll is going down. It's not a cash injection, and that's a huge advantage from a government incentive standpoint.
And then secondly, the great work that the government has been doing around, as Dan alluded to, some of the AI and deep tech work, and really facilitating the research of that at the McGill and other university level, has been really foundational to kind of drawing in folks who are trying to learn some of the most difficult talent pools to access globally. And I think is, a really, really smart, frankly, long-term play for setting up Canada for success in, not just the next year or two, but the next 5 to 10 years as those skills are increasingly in demand.
Hugh, please take that same question. Is that smaller companies, how can they use Canada as a magnet? I feel like companies like Dan, they already have an inherent advantage here, or like Shopify, right? They're bigger companies. What are some of your smaller portfolio companies doing?
For everyone on the line, if you have questions about Shred, just ping Lloyd. He'll solve all your problems. I just want to build on a couple of points that were made. In the Bay Area, like companies expanding to Canada, just to give you a color on the pace, 5 years ago, we saw 1 or 2 per year. And I think that Dan AppDirect was kind of a pioneer in that movement. In 2019, it was 1 or 2 per month that opened offices in Canada, and systematically it was focused on the engineering team being remote. And a recurring theme that we've seen in the most successful companies going remote has really been to lean on local partners, who related to the ecosystem and could point to, specific institutions like we've mentioned, the AI supercluster with Mila, Vector, and Amy. Like, these are billions of dollars that have, funded AI powerhouse. But also just to attract the engineering talent you need. Like, there's actually some high momentum company like our friends, Greg Gunn at Commit, Terminal.io and VanHack, and a handful of others that are actually organizing the resources and process to help companies, expand their footprint. But it really is a strategic decision, and I think you need a strong local partner to help you scope the needs all the way down to finding a strong site lead and executing on that recruiting plan. And one thing I did want to touch on with respect to executives that really excites me, we're seeing portfolio companies more and more attract seasoned executive like Kurt, the new CFO at Clearbanc, who moved to Canada after 25 years in the Bay Area.
It is one example of many, many. I think you're going to see not only of global tech execs, but a lot of Canadians redomiciling. We're also seeing US VCs talk about opening up offices in Canada, much the way they, the old firms like Charles River and Battery started in Boston and then opened up in the Valley. I'm talking to a lot of pure VCs that are looking at opening up, and I think that'll be the last shoe to drop in terms of the dominoes falling as the VC just follow the companies.
Absolutely, and maybe like the last point on the exec talent, like it's still, you still need to pay up. I think, to import the right individuals, and to the change in mindset argument. What I'm finding really exciting, Chris, to your point, is that you're seeing CEOs now have this like storm the castle mentality, where the mindset is we don't lose exec candidate, and pursue them much more aggressively than in the past. And I think that's another key pillar, right? Like, you need to be open to paying up and importing the people you need if you can't find them locally.
Yeah, I'd love Chris to dive a little more on this exec talent, right? Because if you look at it, there's multiple buckets here. And traditionally, even for us in building the team in Canada, the engineering talent is great. Sort of like when you look at growth, marketing, executive talent, there's more of that expertise in the Bay Area because it helps scale and so on. So how do you think, because Hugues used a good word here, or interesting word here, saying importing, right? Importing versus build from within. So how do you convince executives, especially for sort of like your Series A stage companies, to come in to Canada? And then is there enough critical mass of executive talent in Canada to begin with to go around? Because I think once that critical mass hits, then it's boom.
Yeah, so this is a question that's been around for 20 years. And I think the cool thing about it is, and this is what I experienced at Newbridge when we went from 0 to $1 billion, 6 out of Ottawa, and credit to Toby and Harley, building, Shopify up to 4 billion. You look at most of that talent across the board, engineering, sales, marketing, was homegrown. So that culture of really investing in your people and growing them and scaling them, getting them the right kind of mentorship, I think is and should always be the core for a startup. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't augment that with talent where needed. I placed in the chat a company that we've invested in, CareerList, that's partially based in Toronto, partially based in New York. And 100% of their business is placing engineering talent, sales and marketing talent, really between the two hottest markets in North America right now, being New York and Toronto. And the stats there are just staggering, not only in terms of placement, but I think really interesting what Michael's been able to do there is really break down the barriers and the concerns of, Canada's a scary place. I have to cross a border. What's that going to mean for my family? And the bid has really flipped, I think, in part because of what's happening in the US, in part because of the success that Canada's having. I'm seeing very, very seasoned, senior execs from companies like Google, Facebook. Luke just left Facebook to go join the Shopify team. Matt McGowan, who runs revenue worldwide for Snap, is doing it out of Toronto. So I think the density of sales and marketing talent is there. And, if you're thinking about it, absolutely this fall is, the time to get off, your tough and go find the best person on the planet and go get them. Because one of the things that's happening this fall, and the last thing that I think really makes it difficult to recruit talent, is once their families are settled and their kids are in school, and there's no school this fall. And that's a reality in the United States. There isn't school. Families don't feel safe. So if you've got somebody that you're after, as Dan said, you got to pay up. I don't think it's paying up. You're paying for the talent you're getting, and it'll propel you. And I think, we're seeing that. You just got to go do it. It bugs me a little bit. Maybe you can hear it in my voice, but this question's been around for 20 years, because I think you can absolutely go and have success if you focus on it. And so many companies have proven that, including Dan's. And look, we got Cherry on the phone. She was recruited out of the US, prime example.
Yeah, before I'd like to ask that question to Cherry as well. But if Ryan Smith at Qualtrics was able to attract Bay Area talent to Utah, we should be able to do a 10x better job. Not taking anything away from Utah, but I'm saying we have a more of a dominant ecosystem. But Cherry, what were some of the things that attracted you to take a position as an exec with a Canadian company?
Sure. And also Qualtrics, another Accel family company. I think a great example actually of what Dan was alluding to with regards to know what you're getting in each of these geographies. Qualtrics has one of the most impressive inside sales organizations in the planet. And so Utah is actually a great place for them to be from a cultural standpoint. So I think just underlining that in terms of, know the talent pool of where you are and use that to your strength, right? It's every place has a different population of people and a different set of folks with different skills. And Qualtrics was able to capitalize on that to great effect. And we were really proud to partner with them. In terms of kind of like my recruitment story, honestly, for me, it was really around like two things, being very, very frank. One was people. And just meeting Dax and Chelsea, who was our longtime VP of HR, Dave Sherry, who is our CFO, who's now the CFO at Brazilian Unicorn. I just adored them when I interviewed with them and really saw eye to eye. I frankly did not know that much about like retail point of sale at the time. It was not an industry that was like on my hot list of things to go work in. But I just thought that, values-wise, we were incredibly aligned, and it was a place where I thought I could make a difference. The other thing, and this kind of goes to, Chris's point of like this last domino dropping, a very personal part of my story was, I was coming from private equity. I, was a finance person. It was a very stable, perhaps overpaid in retrospect career. And I took an 80% pay cut to go to Lightspeed. And what convinced me to do that was a big chunk of it, frankly, was the fact that Accel had backed the company. And I knew that I didn't have, the chops to evaluate an early stage company at the time. Lightspeed had only raised a Series A of, at the time, this was considered a large Series A, $30 million because Dax had bootstrapped the company for a while. And I just had the awareness that like I didn't know how to pick a 60-person company. And so I kind of outsourced that decision to the VC firm and knew that Accel had invested in folks like Facebook and Dropbox and some other names that I was very familiar with. And that was a huge part of my belief in the fact that like I wasn't, making a quote unquote mistake going to Lightspeed. But it helped, folks are, I think, in my conversations with folks who are young and kind of thinking about their careers now, one of the things I advise people is like, you are taking on a lot less risk than you think you are. But folks will look for those risk mitigants when they can. And for me, it was the fact that even if the company went kaput, I would, have a great time working there because of the talent that was there and the culture that was there. And then the second part was frankly having this name brand VC that had backed the company and done the diligence. And I knew that it was a quality group of folks to be joining.
Yeah, Cherry, it's a great point. I saw Alyssa in the prompt, you asked a question around how do smaller companies compete with some of the larger companies. And I do think one critique of Canada that I'd still provide is that there is a lot more risk aversion. And as people alluded to, the understanding of equity isn't as pronounced. Hopefully with Shopify as an example and people seeing, huge value accretion from public stock, more, Canadians will be willing to take that risk. But I think in order to, take the leap to be at an early stage company, you need to make that trade-off on, I'm going to take, lower salary potential for overall upside. And I think in the Valley, people live for that and they understand like, okay, I want to, I'm going to take a huge pay cut. I think actually the reality is in the Valley today, it's so expensive to live that people aren't making those decisions anymore. Whereas in cities in Canada, you can still live great with, a fraction of the cost. So I think if you're in the right, hub, you can have an amazing cost of living, take the risk, understand the value of the equity, and joining a 20-person startup or smaller is amazing. So I think, Alyssa, to answer your question, you really have to sell the value of the equity, but articulate and show examples of people who have, done far better and made more difference, right? Like Cherry, working with great people and innovating and being in growth, that's fun as well. So I think more stories need to I think propagate across the Canadian community where people are willing to take that risk, because that still is something that I see not happening enough.
And show them apartment listings. I remember going apartment hunting in Montreal and just being like, wait, I can get this for how much? Coming from New York, and it's even worse in the Bay. So, encourage folks once they're pretty far down in the pipeline to take a look at what, $2,000 a month will get them in your respective geographies.
Better, less expensive lifestyle. Go on, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, no, just picking up on Cherry's point, I think people just underestimate this. Is one of the things that Michael Sissions, the founder of CareerList, really did a big unlock in terms of moving talent from New York, from the Bay Area, and up into Canadian cities. Which is, if you make $200,000 US right out of school as an engineer, it sounds like a lot of money to most kids coming out of school, and it sounds like a lot of money to kids coming out of school to Canada. But you go to San Francisco, half of that goes away in taxes, and half goes away to pay for your apartment that you're sharing with 3 other people that's less than 500 square feet. So you're left with 50 grand trying to live in San Francisco. Good luck, you can't do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why you saw more people hired in Toronto in the last 12 months than all US hubs combined. So just don't be shy about it, and lean into that advantage. I think, the quality of life aspect of doing startups in Canada is way underestimated, and you have a flat and equal playing field and access to markets, other talent, other great opportunities, and capital to invest in your startup. Why would you not pick a better place to live, with your family?
Definitely. And, people have this misnomer on taxes. I moved from Canada here 15 years ago to the Bay Area, and the federal is 37% almost, and the state is almost 10-12%. You're paying 50% in tax. So I gave you the math right there. I want to take the last couple of questions. I know we're almost on the hour, but Hugh, there's a lot of everyone said fantastic things. Give us a couple of pitfalls, 1 or 2 things to look out for as you're scaling and thinking about Canada. What are some things that Canada can do better?
Oh, you keep the tough question for me right at the end, Lloyd. I'll get you for that. But no, I think, based on what everything was said, I think talent remains both the opportunity and the challenge. It's really, really hard, to Cherry's point, to build a well-functioning enterprise sales engine, and you just need the people that have been there and done that. And so I think the real opportunity here is, as a founder, to get out of your way and really start identifying the people that can make a difference for your business, and just be aggressive and just go get them wherever they are. The advantage structurally with Canada is that, you can import 100x more faster that talent relative to other places in the world. So I think it's both the opportunity and the biggest challenge still. I do feel like capital is now available for the cohort of growth stage company. The main opportunity for us is going to be to cement that momentum, so that the cohort of companies that have scaled can continue to grow into global technology companies. So there's always a lot of work, but I do feel like the stars are kind of aligning, to Chris's point, to unleash the momentum and the ecosystem.
I want to ask that same question of everyone else here. 1 or 2 pitfalls that we can improve on. I think 10 years ago it was capital. Right now I'm seeing more and more US VCs being comfortable with investing in Canadian companies that are solid. So that doesn't seem like a big concern. But what are some pitfalls you see, Dan, Chris, and Cherry?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly because Dan and I were at the C100 Growth Summit, where I think the number one thing that I'd point to is, everyone remembers the On the Podium when Canada decided to win the gold medals on home ice in Vancouver, when we'd never won a gold medal before. And it was just a failing of ambition. And with enough focus and excitement, Canada won more gold medals, in that home games than any country before or since. And that was a big motto, as we were starting to scale up. And I remember Chamath, I love him. He's a Toronto boy, he's a Canadian. But, he looked dead in the eye of Harley and said, there'll never be $1 billion company in Canada from a revenue point of view. And there sure as hell won't be one in Ottawa. And sometimes I just pointed out, as we do ourselves a disfavor of, pulling each other down instead of supporting each other and pushing each other for greatness. I see that less and less. There's no question in my mind there could be another 10 Shopifys in the next decade if we work together and support each other. So that's one thing, I'll just say over and over again, we do too much of pulling each other down instead of helping each other out. So put that out there. The winters are fucking long, cold, and dark. Maybe global warming will help on the cold part. I don't think we'll be able to tilt the earth to deal with the dark part, but I do think finding, in all sincerity, ways to make that winter, especially in an environment where we can live remote, making it easier for employees to find ways to have flexibility in their lives and have these great environments at work. Combining those two things would be awesome. Winter in Barbados, I see posted in the chat. Not a bad idea.
Not a bad idea. Awesome. Any parting thoughts, Cherry, Hugh, Dan?
I'd love to see Canada just take a next leap on, let's say, riskier, more ambitious, opportunities. So I think what made Silicon Valley so differentiated for so long was the deep tech focus and engineering focus. And Cherry mentioned as well, like the schools, like McGill and the investments in AI, I think can set the groundwork for that. But I think there's still, opportunities for the next SpaceX to be in Canada or the next, AWS equivalent. So I'd love to see, bigger problems being tackled and more people across the country willing to take the risk to jump on to big ideas.
How about you, Cherry?
Yeah, I think, one thing that's a little, one thing I think like is a failing of the Canadian ecosystem is like not asking and not being a little bit more aggressive on things, right? Like there's kind of this built-in assumption like, oh, this person's from the Valley and, has this fancy career at Facebook or Google or whatever, and therefore like would never want to come to Canada. I think especially today, like with everything that's going on in the outside world, folks are a lot more flexible, to Chris's point. Kids are all over the place. Working relationships are, very difficult. We're all on these little video screens. Just ask, there's no harm in asking. And I think the Canadian culture of, being polite and reserved and, there's almost a little bit of like an insecurity complex sometimes. Just ask and be aggressive and be ballsy. Like take a page out of a East Coast New York person's book. Like you just got to go for it.
Awesome. And we'll end the conversation with Hugues. I'm super thankful. Hugues and from Inovia Capital helped me put this together and pretty much did all the heavy lifting. So I'm super, super thankful here. Hugues, what do you see is the single biggest opportunity for Canada in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, this was super fun. Like for me, again, like it's going back to this cohort of growth stage companies. There's about 60 companies, that are really scaling in Canada. And I think we just gotta be aggressive, to everyone's point, in accessing the right talent, the right capital partner, and the right expertise. You need to coach the exec team and establish board that can really support the company as it grows. Like the world is flush with cash. What continues to be rare is like the experience of people who have been there and done that. And so I think the flywheels effect are in motion. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the panel. I'm obviously super bullish on Canada for the next 10 years, and it's just great to hear everyone else's experience.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us.
I need some traction.